Hello crafty friends, this is Jennifer and I'm here with a new card making tutorial. Thank you very much for joining me. I have a quick note to start with. Recording the voiceover is always a very long and difficult process for me and therefore always takes many days. So I ended up recording the first part of the voiceover at home, but a large part on holiday in different places, which means the quality varies greatly. As I said, this is very time consuming for me, so I hope you forgive me for leaving it at a somewhat poor quality in some places. Thank you. A little while ago, I shared a video in which I showed you how you could create an accordion flip card without a specialty die, so just using dies from your stash. And I'll link the video down in the description box. And today I'm going to show you an alternative approach to this type of card. Instead of using a joint to connect the flip panels to the frame, I'm using clear thread, just like you would use for a spinner card, for example. And I got the idea because I was thinking about creating such a card using the same die for the window and the flip panel. So there would be no room for a joint, and therefore I got the idea to use clear thread instead. I made a rough example and I just taped the thread down with some washi tape, which wasn't ideal. You can see it's somewhat working, but it got stuck in some points. So I think if you do a precise job, you can get it to work. But since I wanted to use a shaker panel, which is quite thick, I knew it wouldn't work, and I therefore decided to create a bigger window, so a window that is bigger than my flip element, but still use the thread instead of a joint. First, I'll create my trifold card base that will form the frame. I'll show you two ways to create a trifold card. For both options, I'll start with a 4 3/4 inch square card base. I've also prepared a template for my decorative panels, which is 4.5 inches tall and has a 3.5 inch circular opening. And to achieve a clean look, I try to center the opening as much as possible so that the openings of all three panels are neatly aligned at the end. I center my template on the first panel of the card base to properly align my circle die. Then I crank it open through my die cutting machine to cut the first opening. Then I remove the template and close the card in the opposite direction to place the die cut circle through the opening on the outside of the second panel. Now I can use this to line up my die. I closed the card in the opposite direction, so the clean cut of this opening would also be on the outside. I went into more detail on this topic in my first video. Okay, now I can attach the third panel. And the first way to do that is to create a tab that will attach the panel to the card base. To do that, I cut a piece of paper to the height of 4 3/4 inch, which is the height of the card base. And the width is significantly larger. Then I scored it at 4 3/4 inches, which creates a pretty wide tab. Now I have to determine how wide the tab can be without sticking out of the window, and cut it to the right size. Before I attach it, I cut a teeny tiny piece of the card base on the side where the tab will be attached. This is an optional step, but it ensures that nothing sticks out. Then I can attach the tab to that edge, making sure the tab is on the side of the rough cutting edges, meaning the outside remains all clean, while the rather ugly parts are all on the inside of my card panel. Now that my trifold card is finished, I can die cut the circular window into the last panel, and I did this as before, and used one of the die cut circles as a guide. If you plan to add a decorative panel the same size as the frame, the card base would be finished at this point. However, since my decorative panel is smaller than the card base and therefore leaves a small border all around, I need to hide the tab of the third panel. For this purpose, I cut another piece of cardstock to the size of my card base and then die cut the circular window. And a few tweaks later, I can attach this additional panel to my center panel to hide the tab. And this finally finishes my trifold card base. So if, as mentioned before, you add a decorative panel that is the same size as the card base and can thereby forgo the additional panel, I think this first option works well as it saves you paper. However, if, as in my case, you want to add a decorative panel that is smaller than the card base, I would choose this second option. To do this, I start with two equally sized card panels, which I then put together to form a card base with three panels. To ensure that nothing sticks out, the fuzzy crafter can cut a teeny tiny piece off the two edges, each of which ends at the fold line eventually. This step is optional, but in my opinion it gives a cleaner look in the end, so I always prefer to take this small detour. And as you can see, I take this very seriously. Now I can connect the trimmed panel of the first card base with the trimmed panel of the second card base, and I make sure that the opening of one of the card bases faces upwards while the one of the other card base faces downwards. This gives me a trifold card base with the desired zigzag fold in the end. Now I just have to cut the three circular windows into the three panels, and of course I could do that in the same way as with the first version, but I'm using my first card as a template since I have this option. And as with my first card, I make sure that all the clean cutting edges are on the outside and the rough edges are on the inside. Now let's finally get to the flip panels. Here you can see my first panel, which I have already prepared and to which I have already attached the transparent nylon thread. I will show you how I did it in just a moment, but first a few general tips. In my first video on this type of cards, I explained that it is easiest to use symmetrical shapes for both the opening and the panels. Or for non-symmetrical shapes, I recommended using ones that you also have the mirror image of. So in my case, the pumpkin that I chose is symmetrical. The stem, on the other hand, is not. But I luckily also have the mirror image of it. And now I just have to make sure that I attach the stem in such a way that all the panels are congruent when the card is folded shut. So when attaching the stem to the pumpkin, I make sure that they are each correctly aligned. And I use video magic to speed up the process, which I repeated for all remaining pumpkins that I need for my two cards. And here they are. Now I want to show you how I attach the transparent nylon thread to the back of the panels. For the mechanism to work properly, the thread must be attached as centrally as possible. To find this center, I made a small template by cutting out the pumpkin from copy paper and folding it vertically. I can now align this template with my panel and fold over any half of the template and trace the line with a pencil. I then extend this line, which represents the middle of my panel, to the end of the stem using a ruler. Then I apply a strip of 1/4 inch double-sided adhesive tape along this pencil line and cut off the excess right at the edges. After removing the release paper, the pencil line is visible again, and I was able to align the nylon thread with it to stick it exactly along the center line. I left the ends quite long on both sides to have enough room when I want to attach the panel to the frame. Then I stuck a second strip of the double-sided adhesive tape right over it to hold the thread in place. And I carefully cut off the excess, making sure I don't cut the thread with it. And now I have to repeat the same steps for the other 4 panels. But in order to not bore you with endless repetitions, let's skip this and go to the next step, which consists of attaching the connector pieces that connect 2 flip panels to each other to the middle flip panel. And for this purpose, I cut a narrow piece of cardstock that ends up being 1/4 inch wide, and I want to attach it as centered as possible to the middle panel. To do this, I again use my template that I cut from copy paper, but this time I fold it in half horizontally. Then I line it up with my middle panel and mark the center on the left and right with a pencil. Then I use my ruler to make a tick mark 1/8 of an inch above and below this center line, so I know exactly where to attach my connector piece. I extend these markings with the help of my ruler, and as you can see, the distance between the lines is 1/4 inch, which is exactly the width of my connector piece, which I can now attach with a little liquid glue. And it's important to attach it so that the ends stick out on the left and the right, because these will form the connection to the 2 other flip panels to connect them to the middle panel. You'll see what I mean in a moment. Now I fold both ends over and make sure that the creases are straight and outside the flip panel, i.e. that they protrude a tiny bit, as you can see here.
Here I show you that by folding the paper strip back on itself, you can make sure that the fold is straight. And I cut the slightly longer end a little shorter because I don't need it that long, but this is all optional because the length doesn't really matter. It just needs to be long enough so you can securely attach it. I have already prepared the decorative panels for the back of the flip panels. And since my middle panel is finished, I can already attach the back piece to it. And of course, I also added a decorative back for my stem, not just the pumpkin. Now we can connect the flip panels to the frame. And to do this, I first align the frame on my grid mat and mark the center above and below the circular window. And then I stick a piece of double-sided tape over each of these markings. I also prepare a narrow strip of acetate that is about as wide as my tape, and I'll explain in a moment why this step is helpful. But first, I remove the release paper from the 2 adhesive strips, center my flip panel, and attach the clear nylon thread to the exposed adhesive. And I fix it in place with a tiny piece of tape, and repeat the same steps for the top. Now I pull the end of the nylon thread tight, remove the release paper from the small piece of adhesive tape, and stick a piece of the narrow acetate strip onto it. Then I fold the nylon thread over and attach it to the acetate strip using more of the tape. And then I can cut off the excess nylon thread. And then I have to repeat the same steps at the bottom.
And as promised, I would now like to explain why I use the acetate strip when attaching my thread. For comparison, I stick some of the tape on a piece of paper and attach some black thread to it. I secure it with another piece of tape and then fold the thread over. And by the way, folding the thread over like this ensures that the thread cannot simply slip out. So this is why I do that. Now when I pull hard on the thread, you can see that the tape will eventually tear. You can probably imagine how I know. If I now repeat this whole thing, but this time stick a piece of acetate in between, the bond becomes very, very stable, and even if I pull with brute force, it won't tear. And now I have to attach the two other panels, but since I did this in the same way I did it for the first one, I'm going to skip ahead. Before I can connect the flip panels to each other, I need to cut my decorative frames for the inside. And I cut two decorative frames from cream colored cardstock and one from powder pink colored cardstock. And I spritzed all of them with some distress spritz in the color fossilized amber, diluted in rubbing alcohol to make it more subtle, and I also splattered the panels with some gold paint. And then I attach my 3 decorative frames to my card base. And once that step is done, I can finally connect the flip panels together. To connect the first panel to the second, I lay the card face down on the table, so I'm looking at the decorated inside, and I align the flip panels so they're also face down. Then I fold the right connector piece inwards. As you might remember, the connector pieces are the 2 white cardstock strips that protrude from the left and right side of the second panel. Then I apply liquid glue to the side of the connector piece that is facing me, and fold the left side of the card towards the center. This allows me to pick up the connector piece with the back of the first flip panel. Then I make sure the 2 pumpkin shapes are lined up correctly, meaning they are flush when the card is closed. Now I just have to press it down briefly until the glue dried, and then I could check whether the mechanism is working. And since this is the case, I can attach the decorative back to my first panel. I already adhered the stem, so I just have to attach the pumpkin. And this is what it looks like from the back. Now I need to connect the second to the third flip panel. And to do this, I close my card and make sure the flip panels are all properly aligned. This means that the first and second panels are stacked back to back, and the second and third panels are stacked front to front. Now I guide the connector piece that's attached to the second panel up through the window opening and apply liquid glue to the side facing me. Then I fold the connector piece over and attach it to the back of the third panel. I again make sure that all of the pumpkins are perfectly aligned and that my connector piece is well adhered. And then I just have to cover up the back with a clean panel. And here is the decorative back that I want to use for this purpose, and I just adhere it using liquid glue. And coming up, I have a few tips for decorating the frame, but the mechanism is already finished at this point. So first I want to attach a decorative frame to the outside of my closed card, which is relatively unspectacular because I do it the same way as on the inside. But what might be interesting is how to attach further objects. If you want to attach an object to the frame or the flip panel and it doesn't exceed the boundaries, it doesn't matter where you attach it. However, if you want to place a motif so that it protrudes from the frame over the flip panel or vice versa from the flip panel over the frame, then you do have to pay attention to where to attach these so that they don't hinder the mechanism. So let's go back in time a bit, at least as far as the video footage goes, because that's the best way I can show it to you. As you can see, the pumpkin's tendril, which is an object that is attached to the flip panel, extends beyond the frame on the left, while the tendril on the right remains inside the window. This is important because this flip panel flips outwards on the left and inwards on the right. As a side note, all odd-numbered panels follow this direction of movement, and the even numbers are the opposite. So back to the tendril. The one sticking out on the left doesn't hinder the mechanism, while it would block it on the right. And the opposite is true if you want to attach something to the frame. Then you're limited to the right side, so as not to hinder the mechanism. I want to have some leaves at the bottom of the pumpkin, so I have to attach them to the right side of the frame. But since I also wanted to have a leaf on the left, I have to put it behind the pumpkin or behind the flip panel in general, so that it doesn't hinder the mechanism. And while all of this applies to the first panel and also, for example, the third one, the second panel and all even-numbered panels move in the opposite direction. So this means you have to pay attention to how the flip panel moves when you open the card, and then attach your objects accordingly. If you're unsure, you can simply use temporary glue and test whether the mechanism still works. Before I end the video, I would like to briefly compare this accordion flip card version without joints with the version with joints. Visually, I definitely think this version looks prettier, although I have found that the version with joints is a bit more stable. As you can see, it can happen that the panels fold in the wrong direction, which is of course not a big problem, but it's still undesirable. I definitely like both versions, and I think it just depends on the shape of the window and the flip panels, which one I would choose. In any case, I really hope you liked the video and above all that it was helpful to you. If so, I would be very happy if you could give it a like so that YouTube also recommends it to other crafters. I listed the supplies as well as the mentioned video down in the description box. And finally, I would like to thank you very much for watching this video, and I hope to see you again next time. Bye bye!